This is the first of our research and inquiry example videos, and this one is an example of the sort of activity you might be doing with a student teacher who is at that very early pragmatic stage, the survival stage, or perhaps actually they could be at the very early stage of their second placement when they're in a new school, they might be having a bit of a wobble, or they're finding that things don't work quite in the same way, and we know that the student teachers will sometimes need almost a little bit of a step back at that point to consolidate some things. This is the idea that we can work on a specific aspect of teaching by practicing it, using the idea of deliberate practice with the support of their mentor. Now, deliberate practice is a thing that is rooted in research, and there's a fantastic paper on it, Deans for Impact, Practice with Purpose. It's also rooted in classroom work, and it's where you as the mentor can really come into your own and give an awful lot of advice and help and support from that extensive craft knowledge of classroom teaching that you've got under your belt from your years in the classroom. So first of all, here's a quote from the paper which explains more about the idea of deliberate practice.
Okay. So Deans for Impact say that deliberate practice is practice that is purposeful and designed to maximise improvement. Beginning or pre-service teacher preparation cannot produce experts immediately. In fact, developing true expertise likely takes more hours than any teacher preparation programme can possibly provide. But novice teachers who have had the opportunity to practice deliberately are on the path to being ready to teach as they begin their careers and develop deeper expertise over time. And they make a big point in this paper about it being about the quality of their practice and not quantity. So getting them to just do something again and again and again without taking the time to make it more purposeful and to engage in what Deans for Impact coined the 5 principles of deliberate practice, then they're not necessarily going to get any better. So they're 5 principles of deliberate practice that they derive from their own research involve pushing beyond one's comfort zone, working toward well-defined specific goals, focusing intently on practice activities, receiving and responding to high-quality feedback, and developing mental models of expertise. This is something that we've talked about in a previous podcast episode that we've put out with colleagues from the Teach First programmes. We talk about novice teachers not having had any previous classroom experience and therefore not having anything to picture to fall back on that would help them in the moment to deal with some seemingly really basic techniques that are fundamental to managing a class or to teaching and learning more generally.
And it's really important here to point out that we philosophically opened up this space for things like deliberate practice. The student teachers don't teach as many whole lessons on the new programme as they did on the old programme, and that can cause some concerns, some understandable concerns, that they're not seen to be clocking up the hours in front of the pupils in the classroom. And this is why it's really important for us all to understand that research and inquiry is not something which involves the students sitting with their nose in a book all the time. It can involve them having more time in front of pupils, more time working on their actual teaching practice in the classroom, but it's more of a focused, deliberate practice approach than the idea that if we just keep banging out whole lessons that things are going to get better. So never be afraid to prescribe your student teacher activities that get them up in front of a class if it is that sort of focused practice approach. Let's look at an example. Let's imagine that we've got a student teacher and they're really struggling right at the very opening of the lesson, the bit where you get the pupils into the room, sat down, and you get the lesson started in a kind of organised, orderly and quick way. So you're down to business straight away. And you as the mentor are giving some feedback to the student that this really isn't going very well and that it's setting the scene for, not a great lesson from that point onwards. What might we actually do as mentors with our student teachers in order to address that problem?
So if we go back to the Deans for Impact 5 principles of deliberate practice, we could say that there we've got a well-defined specific goal, which is to safely, calmly, quietly get the pupils into the lesson. So step 1 is to identify, obviously, that very precise goal for the student teacher. And obviously then you're going to need to help them to push beyond their comfort zones. That might initially involve you asking them to observe you conducting threshold techniques, getting them into the class, and to get them to kind of critique what you did. Maybe if they are a student teacher that needs a few more prompts, you might question them yourself after an observation. You might indeed also film yourself and film that portion of the lesson so that you can both reflect together on aspects that made it successful afterwards and engage in a learning dialogue around that.
And it's really nice if you can find some way of facilitating something that goes beyond just demonstrating it to that sort of modelling approach where you're able to give a commentary, an explanation of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And whether that's in the moment, so whether the student is sort of there by your side during that vital first 5 or 10 minutes of the lesson and you're kind of quietly explaining to them what you're about to do and why you're about to do it, or whether you get them to do it and you're commenting, into their ear, giving them prompts, or whether you use the video approach. Just that ability to throw light on your decisions and your choices is a really important first stage to help the student teacher understand what the nuts and bolts are behind what it is that's going on in the classroom.
And then you're going to want to move them towards practicing that aspect of their practice. So you might create some really low stakes circumstances for this that would be really beneficial to the student teacher. They might feel slightly strange to begin with. So for example, to an empty room, practice it in front of you, or indeed on their own. Get them to consider and maybe even script what they're going to say to the learners when they're outside of the classroom, how they're going to orchestrate and how they're going to facilitate their entrance into the classroom. Maybe even getting them to plan out how they're going to coordinate getting them sat in their seats. If they're in drama, how you're going to coordinate getting them into a circle, what configuration they're going to be in that circle. So getting them to plan that out, maybe with you or away from you, coming back to you to show you what they've done, and then getting them to practice that in a low stakes environment.
You can then come up with a way of kind of slowly increasing the stakes there by finding some classes to do it with, maybe grading up in level of difficulty of controlling them, or maybe slowly, step by step, removing the amount of support that you give. So maybe they're just standing by you early on, just kind of in the room with you, and you move gradually to the point where they're actually leading the start of the lesson. And then maybe at the final stage, you're doing some sort of focused observation. You're making some really detailed blue book, formative comment book comments about what's going on. Perhaps you've got that video camera back out again, and now instead of you being videoed, you're videoing the student, and you're able to use that as the basis for a reflective dialogue afterwards. And at every step during all of these processes, the student needs to be actively reflecting, thinking about what they're doing, thinking about what you're doing, thinking about what the impact is on the pupils, so that eventually when they come to do these things, less kind of thinking about every explicit step of it, more sort of automatically, they still understand deeply and philosophically why it is they're doing, what the point is of them doing that.
And another stage that you could involve, that you could prescribe for them, is to do some reading about this very, very focused aspect of their practice. So, for example, you might direct them towards the work of Doug Lemhoff, who indeed talks about threshold as a technique in his book Teach Like a Champion. And then you're hopefully going to start to help them move towards the development of what the Deans for Impact call a mental model. They describe deliberate practice as producing and relying on mental models and a mental representation to guide student teachers' decision making. So these models allow practitioners to self-monitor performance, to improve their performance. So once you've done all of this work, they've done some reading, they've done some practice, they've had some high quality feedback from you, and they've maybe written a reflection off the back of that, perhaps using one of the reflective models that we've got on PebblePad. They will hopefully have developed a really strong mental model that they can replicate, or indeed that they can call into memory if they're in a very new situation to fall back on down the line.